Hello, my name is Oscar. I'm a front-end developer at Thunder, and I'm going to be talking about faster image loading. So why do we care about it? Why does it matter? So I'd say for most sites, images represent a large chunk of the total app size, unless you're running Craigslist. I would say for most of all other sites, it's a large portion. So it's something that you can optimize it, and if you do it well, the user won't see any difference in the rendered output, but we're going to really improve user performance, user experience. So one thing we can do is to start loading the images earlier. So so in the case that we don't need the image right away, maybe it's behind a tab, maybe it's below the fold. So one simple thing is to add the image on the head with the preload attribute, and this will tell the browser that this is a resource that it will eventually be needed, but it should be loaded with low priority. The problem with that is it's still a working draft. It only works on Chrome and Opera. So what we can do is, this is not telling the browser that this is a low priority resource. So this image will be loaded with the same priority than everything else on the page. So it's something to keep in mind, but it will effectively preload the image. Another problem with this is that if you forget that slash, i10 will render a beautifully blank page. So just keep that in mind. And so just very briefly, a demo of this. So we are gonna throttle the connection, and so what we see is that here we see the image that we preload loading. So when we click on run, the preloaded image loads faster than the no preload one.
Oh, and also it won't, like it'll still pass the WBC validation.
The what?
It'll still be valid code because it's inside the head image tag.
I very much doubt it.
Okay.
Yeah, it will. So I test on a bunch of browsers, and except for that, I think I didn't see any rendering issues with any, but I very much doubt that that will be valid. So, okay, but for most cases, we really just need to load the image right away, and we want to do it as fast as possible. So what can we optimize? So one thing that's very easy to overlook, file size, so that if we have a container that's 200 pixels, we obviously want to load an image that's 200 pixels. If you want to deliver also Retina resolution images, then conditionally serve those, but only for the cases where we care about that. So we can use source set there or any other way, but basically we are not sending more pixels than we want to. Another thing to keep in mind, we want the right format. So usually if you have very few colors, you will want to save something as PNG. If not, if it's like a higher resolution image, then probably you'll want to go with JPEG. But these are not the only options. And even within the JPEG, obviously we can compress things with different formats. It's very hard to tell here, but I promise you that they look very different. So with the JPEG 51 here, it's really hard to tell on the projector, but there are much more artifacts just because it's saved with a quality setting of 50 compared to the other one that's at 90. Similarly with the PNG, we see a lot more grain because we reduce the number of colors to try to compress it. And WebP is a format that only Google supports. It works on Chrome and Opera. But it allows us to compress images very well while preserving the quality high. Now, the reason why I think this matters is because, so I think what we need is a good way to get numbers on the quality that we are seeing. So saving something as a JPEG at 50 or at 90, it means very different things for different images. So you may save an image at 80 and look good, and save one at 85 and look shitty. And what the end result there is that you end up saving images, at least when you want to do it in an automated way, you end up saving them very conservatively so you don't degrade them too much. So you end up missing out on a lot of potential savings. And so here's where things like SSIM, but really any metric that correlates with how a user would rate the quality of the image helps us optimize. I particularly like SSIM because it's very efficient and it correlates fairly well. Again, it's really hard to tell here, but if we look at the worst example here, poor Einstein, the image is very degraded. And so SSIM would give us a low score. Whereas other images that have less degradation, we get a higher one. So these values correlate much better with how a user would rate those images. And so what we can do is we say, like, look, our threshold is going to be an SSIM of 0.95 or something like that. And then we optimize the images progressively until we hit that threshold. And by doing it this way, we can get much better compressions. And what I think is more important, much more even compressions if you need to compress a bunch of images for a same page. So you won't have something that looks particularly bad next to something that looks on very high definition. Okay, another thing we can do is to save the images progressively versus non-progressively. And here both images end up loading at the same time. Again, because of the resolution of the projector, it's very hard to tell. But even so, the progressive image gives us a much nicer feedback on what the load status is. And this is something that both JPEGs and PNGs support. Although most JPEGs, at least I think, are usually saved as non-progressive. Like to me, it was a surprise to see that you could save a JPEG progressively, because I had only seen this load online. But at any rate, the problem you have is, like, here it's very clear when things finish loading, basically because the non-progressive one is telling us. But if you're only showing the progressive image, it's hard for the user to know if you're just showing them a bad resolution image or if you're still loading. So unless you are careful to provide a very clear feedback, the user experience may end up being worse just by trying to provide this additional feedback. Okay, so let's take a look how this happens in the wild. So here we see on Google, when we try to load images, I'm highlighting this tiger here, and I don't know if we can see here, but what they do is basically they are saving it as base 64. So the bet they are making here is that it's cheaper to incur on the additional overhead of saving the image as base 64 than it would be to have the additional network request for the images. Now, this works well for a page that will have a small file size. It wouldn't work well if we go on a page that has a lot more images, like if we go to Google Images. And so here I'm throttling the connection. And what I think this is pretty cool. What Google is doing is saving the aspect ratio of each image, and they are saving the dominant color. And so usually on a good connection, this will be just a quick flash, and then it will switch to the actual images. Here, because it's throttled, then it takes a while longer. Then we load the image. And what happens if we click on one of those is that it will show that same image. It puts it right here on this container, lets the browser to expand it. And oh man, it's really hard to tell here, but there is a tiny progress bar at the bottom. And so that's what's giving us the indication on how things are loading until it finishes. Now it finished, we see higher resolution one, and the progress bar is gone. So what, yeah.
Hi, question about the loading then. Do you know if they have the ability to tell how far into loading with higher quality images, such as from the progressive?
So the only way I think in which you can tell is if you load it as binary data, and then you have information on the progress. But if you do that, then you're going to be loading it slower than you would otherwise. So you need to balance. If you care a lot about the feedback, maybe if it's a huge image and you want to show progress, you can do it that way. If now we're going to look in a second into what I think is a good approach, that you can simulate that feedback without actually having the information. But yeah, I would argue that if you can just get away with that, then you don't need, then you can load the full resolution image faster. Similarly for Bing, we're also seeing the image saved as base 64. Here it's a lot more images, but they still find it worth it to do it that way. We also see very similarly that for their images page, here they are not even storing the aspect ratio, and it's just the dominant color and then the images. But one thing I thought it was interesting here is that notice that how these images are loading much more slowly than on Google. And so Google is using HTTP 2, but these ones are over HTTP 1, which means that here we see a bunch of network requests, one per image. So where Google is taking advantage of the single connection and can send a lot more data at once because you have the TCP connection warmed up, here you're starting every time. And so we see this much slower load. Now, to be fair, it's much slower because it's throttled. If you're loading this on a normal internet connection, it would still load fast. But I think there's something that they could easily get some gains here just by switching to HTTP 2. Okay, and just one more example with Medium. So if you checked any articles on Medium in the past, let's say a few months to a year, you've probably seen this kind of load. Well, hopefully something better. Where it shows you a thumbnail here, and then once it finishes loading, it shows the full image. And so what I want to show you in a second is something that looks very similar to this approach, in which we show a blurred image first, and then we show the actual content. But the problem with Medium's approach is that they are doing this on canvas. So they are drawing this on a canvas element, which means you're loading the JavaScript, you're parsing it, then appending the thumbnail on the canvas, loading that, and then you show it. And so that's way slower than if we had done what Google was doing on on including those small images as base64 directly, and we could have included this tiny thumbnail that way. So I think the effect is really nice, but I think we can do it in a way that would load faster. So let's take a look at this image, and we say like we grab this image, we optimize it, we've compressed it, we have used SSIM or whatever we want, but now we have it at a file size that we say like this is what we want to serve. So the next step to simulate that effect from Medium, we reduce it to a 3x3 pixel image, so something tiny, and then what we'll do is we'll blur it. So this will be the end result. We have the blurred image at the bottom, filter on top, and then we'll load the image in between, and we'll load it progressively. So by loading it progressively, we'll see the feedback here while we still, and this is the part that I was mentioning before, because like we won't know how far ahead the image is from the total load, but we'll know that some progress has happened. So this is just simulating that approach. And so we see that once we keep loading the image, then we see more of the image every time, and then until we're downloading, and then we just unblur and we're done. So we could do something like that in just very few lines of code. So we have the background image, we put that as base64, and we just add the loading class, so we blur it immediately. If we don't do that on all browsers, they will automatically blur it and will look nice, except for IE. So you really want to blur it. But once you have that, then what we can do is just basically, as soon as it finishes loading, we remove the class, we're done. One thing that I think it's nice to add is to say, okay, we're going to set a timeout, like in this case, 500 milliseconds. You can really set it to whatever you want, but you say, if at that point you have not finished loading, unblur it a little bit. Just because we know that because the image is saved progressively, we know that something has loaded, so that we can unblur a little bit, and it will give the user the sensation that this is actually loading, that is progressing, although in reality we don't know. And then when it eventually finishes, then we do that. So just to recap, we've seen a couple ways in which we can optimize images. We can choose the right file format and choose the right compression. We can do that in a programmatic way by using SSIM or any other metric. We really want to choose an image that fits the container where we want to put it. if we can request something early, we should do it. And if not, we can do something like this progressive loading that we've seen now at the end, or any other approach really. And I added a couple more points because this is by no means exhaustive, but these are other things that may be interesting to look at. I'm gonna put the link on these slides on the Meetup. So if you want to see any of the links that I used to make these slides, I think these were all interesting. So definitely check them out. And that'll be it. Thunder is hiring. Thunder is an awesome company, and we're looking for great JavaScript developers. So so if you want to reach out to us, feel free to talk to me or contact us at bigthunder.com/careers.
Where are you located?
What?
Where are you located?
We are right next to the bus station.
Oh, you're here in Belgium.
Yeah. And actually this Thursday, so if you want to check out the office, we are hosting a meetup this Thursday on Bellevue Web Dev. So you're all welcome. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Questions for Oscar?
Real quick, what does your company do?
Yeah, so we make it very easy for brands and agencies to create ads online. So there are two traditional approaches to creating ads for big companies, and one is by creating lots of ads in bulk in a way that they don't have very fine control on what they are editing. Or the opposite approach, which is you hire a bunch of designers and you are paying every time that you want to make a tiny change. Maybe you want to translate the text, or maybe you want to change a photo. You're going to be paying thousands of dollars for each one of those changes. And so we provide a solution that falls right in the middle, that it allows you to do this bulk submission of ads, to generate a lot of ads and submit them, but at the same time you can control each one of them individually. And it's on a nice web app where it's very easy to make manual edits, so anybody can do it, and you don't need to have a designer go on a Photoshop file and do it.
So I'm assuming you automate a lot of that.
Yeah, so we really care about image optimization.
Right. Very cool.
So a question about the 3x3 matrix that you generate. Is that a simple tool that you use to generate all the images, or how do you do it?
I would imagine you could script it with Image Magic or something like that. If you're doing it manually, you can just reduce it on Photoshop until you have those 3 pixels.
So every time you change the image, you have to do this step of running into Image Magic and
Right.
I was wondering if it is part of the build process, like if you have custom library where you generate the 3x3 matrix and have that drop as part of the build.
Well, I would imagine you could build it as I don't know if you're using Grunt or Gulp, like as a task that runs with the build. I honestly haven't put much thought, but like that's how I would go about automating it.
So at least when it comes to logos, I wonder if you think it's even a good idea to ever use like an SVG over like a ping, for example. Like, what are some advantages or disadvantages to using that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Like if you have a logo on SVG, odds are that it will already be much smaller than what you can compress any other way. So yeah, I would say then just use the SVG and you can embed it directly. You don't even need to use base64, you can just plop it in.
Is there a reason why you went with 3x3, 16x16? Did you do some sort of test or arrive at that?
Yeah, so the reason is a bit silly. I liked it because I can easily keep it under 100 bytes. There's no reason why to do that. It just seemed like a manageable amount of data that you're adding on each page, because for each one of them, let's say that we save it at 100, that it's 100 bytes of data, you're going to be adding that on each image. So depending on how many images you need and depending on the file size, the way I would optimize it is I would say if you really care about performance and you want to send data as fast as possible, your HTML file should be under 4K on a cold connection, so that on the first package that you send, you can send the whole page and render that immediately. So I would say any images, any size will be fine as far as you keep within those 4K. and then if you go above that, then like you'll have to estimate when it's worth it.
Well, I was just asking because it looks like Google and Bing clearly have decided that you could send far
Much larger, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah. Still, like if yeah, so you could send a much larger image, and then you would have less to unblur, so it will look much better initially.